Hello, everyone. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. We have a very special guest today, Kerwin Charles, the Dean of Yale School of Management, and someone who's done a lot of research on wealth inequality as an academic, someone who's had a fascinating personal journey as well. Our topic today is a topic that is very much in the news. And it pertains, of course, to higher education and its role in diminishing, if not eliminating, racial inequality and economic inequality. I think Kerwin is especially qualified to address this issue, not only because he holds a leadership position at a prestigious business school and university, but more importantly, as a result of all the research that he's done in his past before taking on these administrative duties at Yale, which I'm sure you have had very little time to think about research now. Right, Kerwin?
No, I haven't. It's been, I will not ever give up research entirely. But you're right in your conjecture. It's fallen off quite a bit the last 8-9 months.
Yes. I want to talk a little bit about your journey, your educational journey and your journey to the United States. You were born in Guyana and really in a fascinating village. I looked up the history of your village.
Really?
And realized that at one point it was actually purchased by slaves.
Correct.
It's a sort of a protected area, which is fascinating to me.
That is correct. Both my parents are from a small village called Buxton in Guyana, South America. It's a very well-known, though modest little village. Well known because it is one of 2 or 3 places in my country, in Guyana, that was purchased by former slaves in one case, and then actual slaves, enslaved persons in a second case, from previous slave owners. Buxton is one of them. Buxton is also famous for having the world's very best mangoes.
Ah,
the very best.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I know it's right on the water, so it must be a beautiful spot.
It's very lovely city. It's very lovely country. It sits on the northeastern tip of the South American continent, northeastern edge, right next to Venezuela, about an hour by plane from Trinidad. And it is, 2/3 of the country is pristine rainforest. And so it's a nice place to have been from.
Absolutely. What brought you to the United States for higher education?
So I came to the US, it's a good question. My country was socialist. Guyana was socialist when I grew up. Many of my friends, my classmates, left after high school to study in the Eastern Bloc. And so friends of mine studied in then Czechoslovakia, then USSR, and many more studied in Cuba. As I completed my studies in high school, after O and A levels, we learned of an opportunity at the University of Miami, where they were giving a scholarship to people from my part of the world. And I applied to the University of Miami and got a very generous scholarship. Went there intending to study mathematics, stumbled into an economics class at the beginning of my junior year. I remember the class. It was taught by a professor called Phil Robbins, and he was talking about labor markets. And I remember sitting in the class halfway through and thinking, I don't want to do anything else.
Wow, he must be an incredibly passionate teacher.
He was a great teacher.
He converted you on the spot.
On the spot, kind of. So I completed a double major at Miami and then went to Cornell.
Right.
Then the best place to think about, and study labor markets. And I've been in the US since the day I landed, and I go to Guyana periodically. But I consider myself having lived the vast, vast, vast majority of my life here as being a man of 2 places. Yes. As much from the place that I was raised as a child as I am of the place where I live and call my home.
Right. And of course, after Cornell, you also ended up obviously at the University of Chicago.
Yes.
Where you held the position of the head of the economics department, right?
No, let me talk to you about that. I was Before Chicago, I went to Michigan.
Right.
University of Michigan was my first job. I was there, I had a joint appointment in the economics department and in the School of Public Policy.
Yes.
Going to Michigan was, in some ways, the best professional decision of my career. I met there mentors who remain to me persons of incalculable importance today, both in terms of the actual effort expended on my behalf. This is how you do it, that won't work, doesn't so. And in terms of the example they set. After receiving tenure there, I moved to Chicago, and I was in the policy school at Chicago.
That's right.
Yeah. And in the policy school, I served for many years as a deputy dean in charge of all faculty-related matters, appointments, promotions, and the like, and tried to write as many papers as I could. And then after many years of that, I moved here to Yale to take on the duties of the deanship of SOM.
Indeed. How did it come to be that you spent so much of your early life studying labor economics, but in particular, wealth inequality?
Okay, so that's another very good question, John. I would say that the thing that struck me about it, I love economics, as I mentioned, almost from first exposure. And one of the things I liked about it was the rigor with which and the precision with which interactions were defined, classified, the testable predictions could be derived from theory, thus and so. So I liked that. I also am a Black man navigating the world. Yeah.
Right.
And I have friends and family, girlfriend, aunts, cousins, who are themselves navigating, the overwhelming majority of my family lives in the US, navigating life here. And on the one hand, I'm receiving training in economics, which training is highlighting to me, let's take labor markets, for example, the theoretical unimportance of features of the container in which skill is possessed, which is to say that firms should not care whether your eyes are blue or brown, should they? They care about, quote, your productivity, your skill, yeah? Or whether you're a boy or girl, man, or what kind like that, or race. Right. But everything in my lived experience, everything that I heard from friends and family, and much that I observed around me, suggests that, or suggested, that race is indeed a huge delimiter of life capacity. How could that be, given what I was being taught and believed in this field? And so it was natural, in a way, that I would think about race as an important part of my research, because it's so much about racial outcomes, racial processes, racial differences in the US and elsewhere, seemed at variance with my conception of how, say, the labor market, it's not only the labor market, but let's focus on the labor market, ought to be operating. And so the combination of those two things made a focus on racial, not only racial, gender and ethnic and other differences, an essential part of my work.
Was there a moment of clarity when that became a passion for you, assumed importance?
I would say no.
Okay.
I would say it is ever present. And so I was thinking the other day as I talked to a graduate student who was thinking about what she wants to do. But I've written lots of papers over my life. I think, well, what are these papers about? They're all about all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I write on all kinds of topics. But I will often return after a hiatus of 2 or 3 papers to something having to do with earnings or wealth inequality by race. I might pause to write about some other thing, maybe for years. But, and I love and I'm proud of those papers. But I will return to this theme. It is there from the very beginning of my scholarly career. There is no single moment when the realization dawned on me that, oh, this will be a focus of mine. It was a kind of spur. By the way, I think I'm in this regard similar to many academics of color, who live and work in the social sciences. Mm-hmm. If I did, for example, particle physics, per se, it would be less obvious how race could play a role in my scholarly inquiry. But if one is interested in the characterization, the description, the evolution of socioeconomic phenomena, and one is a person of color in particular, right? It would be most odd indeed if there was not this substrain always in the back of one's mind about investigating these questions. Now, how and through what window I would investigate it was a different thing. Do I focus on the labor market? Yeah. Do I focus on consumption? Do I focus on mortality differences? Do I focus on marriage differences? You see? And different social sciences make different choices. I'm an economist. I'm a labor economist, applied microeconomist. So the set of things that have commanded my attention have tended to be in the labor wealth space. Yeah? I'll talk to you if you ask about what might be a shortcoming of that focus, but that has been the focus.
Right. Were you ever dissuaded from pursuing that focus in your life? I mean, you entered a world that was pretty white in academia.
It was and is. This I've thought about too. I would say that I can think of no example where I was explicitly directed or hinted against the practice of including in my research portfolio matters having to do with race. I can think of no example where there was an explicit hint or prohibition or suggestion. Having said that, I will admit to occasionally wondering or being concerned about being seen with sufficient breadth as a scholar. So that, and this too, I don't like to speak for other people, but I suspect that this too is true for lots of Black scholars, where you think, listen, I care a lot about these matters, but I also care about, I don't know, unionization. I care about the minimum wage. I'm curious about immigration. Do you see?
Yeah.
And so the Black scholar carries the slight anxiety, the vague unease, the question that her exclusive focus on race causes others to see him in a narrower intellectual box, space than he appropriately occupied. So whereas no one ever cautioned me against that, there are things we take on in ourselves. I'm gonna show you, you see. I want to do that thing too, what's his name said, you see? Something that I might not care as much about. I say this in all honesty, that it was true for me, and I'm sure it's true for others.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the landmark discoveries you made as a scholar as they relate to income inequality. I mean, you obviously discovered that whites earn a lot more, gather more wealth. And one of your studies, you found that there was really no progress made from the 1950s to the period you studied. What were some of the surprises that you came upon?
So I'll talk about that particular project at length, if you will. The discovery that whites out-earn or have higher levels of wealth is not mine alone. Indeed, there's a generation of scholars of all races who've documented that fact very carefully. And so I'm building upon in my work their ideas, their work, and so on, and extending in ways that fit my style, my technical capacities, and my particular interest. Having said that, I am interested, I thought, in, say, earnings differences. We've already established why labor markets are an especial focus of mine. And in that project, with my friend Pat Bayer of Duke, I'm interested in two things mainly. One is the observation that speaking about the Black-white experience, the differences, the contrast, the gaps, is improperly captured by the mean. Improperly captured by the mean. There's something in this is not profound when you say it, but when one examines the previous literature, it turns out that the overwhelming majority, the 90% of racial comparisons about earnings differences had focused just on the mean difference. My friend Pat Byrne and I said, look, we should look at other points in the distribution, because to the extent that the Black experience is more and more heterogeneous over time, what happens at the mean is less and less reflective of, say, what happens at the tails. And so it would be useful to think about points throughout the distribution. That's point one. A second point is that the overwhelming majority of literature documenting earnings differences, which I should pause to emphasize, is literature I hugely admire and respect. It has been contributed to by many, many prominent Black scholars and others over the years. I think of people like Rogers and Darity and others. And then I think in the economic space of people like Richard Freeman and John Bowne, have focused on the experience of workers. Over time, as the incidence of non-work for both races becomes an ever more important phenomenon, examining contrasts among workers becomes less and less reflective of what is true in the population. Yes?
Yeah.
A third point, and this is them telling you the motivation, is that contrasts that are made by race tend, again, in the 90-odd%, to focus on differences in what I'm going to call for our conversation, and what Pat and I call in the paper, differences in the levels. Yes? So give me the average white guy's income, or wages, or earnings. Yeah? Minus from that thing, the average Black guy. You understand why I'm saying average? I already established that with point one. And that number is equal to X, or theta. And that is the Black-white gap. That's a perfectly legitimate gap. It measures something in the level. But here's a different kind of gap that Pat and I explore and document since 1940. Imagine that a Black man at a certain percentile point in the earnings distribution were put into the white distribution. So conceptually, give me, say, the median Black man, and take his income and put it into the white distribution in that year. Yeah? How far below the median would he be? Notice I'm not even imagining, he'd be above the median. Yes? And so that second thing has received stunningly little attention. And our third contribution in the paper is to document that third thing, what is called, or what we define as, the positional gap. Our observation is that both the level and the positional gap reveal fascinating things about the evolution of earnings differences in the US that are masked by the historical focus of mean differences among workers. In particular, getting back to the question you posed, if one looks at the median, take the Black man in the middle of the earnings distribution, including the population, which is to say, include people not working, yeah, the whole population.
Right.
Then say, where does that Black man rank in the white distribution? What Pat and I show, and this is the first thing that knocked me off my kind of, it blew me away, is that in terms of position, the median Black man ranks as far below the white median today, yeah, as his father did, as his grandfather did.
Wow. Yeah.
There has been positionally virtually no advance, yeah? No advance over the last 75 years. Indeed, if one then asks about the level gap, which I've already described, at the median, there too, one sees things that are disturbing. The level gap at the median closed between 1940 and 1980 or so. And contrary to what the bulk of the existing previous literature said, that there it plateaued and remained. There it plateaued and remained. Byrne and I show that indeed since 1980, it has consistently eroded, yeah? So that it is today as large as it was in 1953.
Wow.
Those are the two big findings at the median. Differences or results elsewhere in the distribution, in particular the top, are quite different. For example, blacks at the top end of the earnings distribution, 90th percentile or so, have made tremendous positional advances. And so we had for 30, 40 years, blacks at the top end of the black earning distribution, ranking consistently below their white counterparts in that example in the thought experiment I just described.
Mm-hmm.
There was a tremendous convergence in their position relative to whites. Yeah? And if you restrict attention to the college educated, the gap is now at an historically unprecedented small level. So among black college graduates at the 90th percentile, they are about 5 percentile points or so below their white counterparts, college educated at the 90th percentile. Meaning if they were white, they'd be 85th percentile, you see.
Right.
There are several things that emerge from that. One is that when one talks about the black experience, one must be careful. One must be careful to speak with subtlety and breadth so as to capture the fact that whereas all blacks rank relative to their white counterparts below in level and position, the experience, the lower down the distribution one goes, is more and more dire. Yeah?
Yeah.
The experience between the median and 90th is hugely different. Yeah? And that must be captured and reflected in our conversation about efforts to remediate.
So I wonder if I should conclude from that observation that higher education is a leveler of some sort.
It is.
Yeah.
I am confident in so concluding. Indeed, I'm going to go so far as to say that our results indicate, if one looks at the timing of various educational initiatives, the paper doesn't, for example, state by state examine the differential timing of the imposition of Brown spending, Brown v. Board spending, yeah? Or the differential adoption city by city of expenditure requisition. It does not do that. Yeah? But one can draw inferences about the likely effect of these broad education-related changes by, for example, conditioning on education, as I've already just described, and by examining particular kind of historical periods when we know what was happening. Yeah? Mm. So we know what was happening after 1980. Wholesale occupational exclusion in the professions. Yeah? The opening up of American higher education to blacks, yeah? In levels and rates theretofore unprecedented. Yeah? Opened up tremendous gains at the 80th and above. At the median, there were also lots of education-related changes. But these changes were not at college or graduate school. The country had for more than a century, I believe, very deliberately underspent on black education, however measured. Yeah? This is not my results or my work. As I say, there are many scholars who've established that. Mm-hmm. When, because of federal policy, those changes were reversed, it turns out that there were tremendous educational gains for African Americans. Mm. Tremendous. In 1950, the median prime age African American man had a 7th grade education. Think about that. Today, the median man has, I'm going to say high school, 12th grade or GED level of education. Yeah. That's a tremendous improvement. Yeah. Indeed, had that improvement not occurred, remember I described the relative flatness of black positional gains at the median, mm-hmm. and the erosion of gains that had been seen between 40 and 70. In the absence of those educational investments, yeah, the flatness in position would have been an erosion in position. Mm. And the erosion in the level would have been even larger. Yeah. However measured, education is a tremendous leveler. I am convinced.
Yeah, totally.
I'm convinced too that education serves another function. You didn't ask this, but I'm talking. And this is true at places like this, where I work now, indeed at every university. Universities serve the function they serve an aggregator interaction function, that the student at a university is brought into meaningful, close engagement with her colleague across the aisle who's fundamentally different, from a fundamentally different racial background. Life circumstances incredibly different. They're taking the same chem class, or the same art history class. They're at the the dorm together, and they're at a party, These are not small things. These are profoundly important things, I think, because they affect the view that both students might have had about the groups from which the other person comes, and I believe affect positively. And so this aggregator function of common is another very important thing in my view.
How frustrating is it to face the limits of scholarship? And when I say the limits of scholarship, you're doing this study and others, and you're seeing this great gap, and the gap is in fact almost disguised by the mean. But all you can do is point it out.
That's good. So if I may jump off on this thing to talk about kind of two limits of scholarship. You mentioned here the frustration that the scholar, I think this is true for all scholars in the social sciences, feel. One writes a paper about bail or eviction or about school buses or whatever. One devotes years to this enterprise. One's collecting data, and one's sitting in one's basement at 2 a.m. and giving talks, and people are ripping the paper apart, and one's rerunning the regression and on. And then the paper's done. And then it's published. God willing. And it's read by 20 people, including one's mom and one's aunt. And that's it. That's it. The ability to shorten the distance between scholarly output and policy and other impact, or the inability to do that, I think gnaws at most scholars. And I think it especially gnaws at scholars of color working on questions of the sort we have described. I will frankly tell you that a desire to shorten that distance in some way before my career draws to a close is one reason that deaning at a school like the School of Management appealed to me in the first place. But I love writing papers. I absolutely love it. In fact, I love writing papers and teaching school more than anything. But fine, there is that frustration. And as dean, I have the ability, I hope, to in various ways shorten the distance. Not necessarily for my own work, maybe for other people's work. That's a big allure. But there's another frustration that is more narrowly disciplinary. It is said by some that economics is a language or something like that. I don't quite agree with that. Modern economics is a science that uses a language of a particular type. It takes certain things to be axiomatic. It sets up models that it knows to be stick figure models. Certain rules govern the interaction between agents in those models. It insists upon a certain kind of evidence. Doesn't so. But it is focused on a subset of outcomes that affect how humans feel about their lived experience, that characterize the entirety of the human being. So I'm a labor economist. I think about wages and earnings and promotion and consumption and so on. Yes. But when I think about the difference in life quality, say, in the fully human experience between the classes of persons studied in my wealth or earnings or consumption's difference paper, what role is the 7% or 17% or 30% wage difference between? How important is that relative to this? With what respect am I treated when I engage with people randomly? How comfortable am I making friends with persons I don't know.
Hmm.
Where can I express my passion for something relatively unfamiliar to my group from the perspective of somebody else? If I show up in the opera, I'm not a fan of the opera, but suppose I were. And I show up at the opera, and it is thought that persons like me do not like it. I'm aware of that. It affects my consumption of this thing. Yeah. What about various frustrations, slights, real or imagined, that bombard me over the course of my day? And I emphasize, this is not true of Blacks alone. Yeah. It's true of us all. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The point I'm making is that the things that define my humanity are only modestly comprehended by the set of things economists study. And so the frustration is knowing that that is true, but not having the language, the tools, the framework, the training, the insight, the brilliance to capture the thing people are talking about. Do you see?
Right.
I can do just my narrow thing. And as I'm doing my narrow thing, I know it's narrow. Do you see? That's a frustration too.
Indeed.
But that's a frustration I suspect all scholars feel. So one learns to live with it. But that's a second frustration.
You, because of your background, because of your study, probably experience the news of George Floyd's death differently than many others, because you have studied the underlying fault lines of discrimination and race. Mm-hmm. When you heard about the death of George Floyd, what was your immediate reaction?
Rage. And I'll tell you, I heard about it from a close friend who told me, my friend's not an academic, he said, "You see this expletive?" And I hadn't seen it. He described it, and I didn't look at it. I couldn't look at it for a while. I was very angry and upset, and in a kind of very passionate way. I just left Chicago, where a couple of years ago there was a police shooting that garnered much attention. My brother, who was my best friend, lived many years in St. Louis. My sister-in-law and her family are from St. Louis. There was a few years ago a shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, which is not far from where she's from.
Sure.
And I can go on with example after example. And so there was a feeling of rage, immediate, overpowering, and so forth. And in some ways, that feeling was, I'm certain, no different from the feelings of Black men, Black people, scholar or no scholar. Yeah? There is a feeling of kind of solidarity, understanding, profound compassion and empathy. There's that. And then there's a feeling of vulnerability. Look, I am a social scientist, and I am aware of small numbers biases. How many school shootings are there? One doesn't have to tell me. But what is it that makes something like this event so salient for me? I think there's something about I mentioned vulnerability earlier. The feeling, I've talked in our conversation about heterogeneity within the race. Mm-hmm. That I will not pretend that the Black people who are professors at Yale, okay, or who work for the New Yorker magazine or work in law firms, have the same lived experience in terms of various labor market and other outcomes as the Black people at the median and below in the cities where they live. I'm not going to pretend that. Anxiety about the police sometimes is a leveler that I will tell you that there are times when I have had encouraged interactions with the police that you, John, I've never met, that you've never had. Yeah. I'm very sure about that.
I have no doubt about that.
I'm sure about that. And I'm sure that any Black man in particular listening to this call knows, has had them too. Yeah? And it is true, Black people not listening to this call. So it is this kind of, this unified thing that there is the reason that police things matter so powerful. Even though one understands their relative rarity, even all of that, I believe, is something about the fact that whatever economic heterogeneity there is this shared race-specific anxiety that many, 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 many Black people feel. Yeah? I certainly feel. And that informs a rage, I think. You will not hear me to be saying, and I hasten to show, I'm not engaged in any anti-police denunciation here or anything like that. I'm not doing that. If you ask me, so how I felt and why, yeah, I'm telling you.
And you know, obviously many people in authority issued statements condemning racism. Mm-hmm. I felt that yours was especially heartfelt and clearly expressed your anger and your shock, but also your acknowledgement that you've even told your children to exercise caution when dealing with the police. Which to me, you know, I suspect that on some level, education and intellect almost separate you from a lot of people. This is especially true in families where you're the first generation college graduate. Yeah. And everyone around you is uneducated. And I wonder, you know, if you thought ever in your life that maybe your intellect, your education would protect you and your family from some of these overt racist events that Black people have to live with.
Okay. So let me first do a bit of correction.
Yeah.
So in my letter, I said that I am unaware of Black families, including my own. And by own here, I meant my very, very close extended family.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
I meant my nephews,
right.
who are teens. I meant my cousins who are in their early 20s. That's what I meant. Yeah? Okay. My family writ large.
Yes.
And in those cases, if I were to talk to my nephews and my cousins, as I do all the time, and they live in major cities in the Northeast, this is a thing I tell them. Yeah, don't be a knucklehead, okay? And by that, I don't mean that they're doing anything bad. I mean, be extra cautious. Yeah, be extra cautious. You know why? Because your dad and I are. Okay, it's not something I'm proud to admit, but it's the truth. That's what I meant. There has never been a time, ever, when I felt that my education or my achievements, whatever they were, such as they are, protected me from random adverse police outcomes. Indeed, there have been times when I have feared the opposite. There have been times when I feared the opposite. There have been times when I feared or worried that, look, precisely because of where I live or what I do or whatever, yeah, I am more likely to attract unwelcome attention than would otherwise be true. Yeah, you see. So I don't know a day when I thought that whatever small achievements or medium-sized achievements I've had act as a kind of shield against this thing. This is what I meant earlier about the unified nature of Black disgust and rage. That there is something about this that Black people get, because it doesn't matter, I don't care what kind of lawyer, you're top of the class, Harvard business, I don't know. If we're together quietly and we talk, I know that those people have had some anxieties like those that I have.
Yes, right. And as a social scientist, grounded in economics, I'm going to assume that you have a close relationship to history.
I do.
And I'm wondering if you believe we are at a special moment in our history where the outrage, the availability of social media, which has only shown this to be a significant and awful problem, meaning that it's always been a significant and awful problem.
Mm-hmm.
And in some points of history has even been worse.
Yeah.
But are we at a special moment? And can you see positive things that could come out of it, or not?
I think you have mentioned a couple of reasons why the moment might be special. There is one, the nature of the evidence. Yeah, that there is, one hears things. And it is natural to wonder about the truth of the things one hears.
Mm.
As I said in my letter, the thing about this event, there's no gainsaying what you say. Yeah? And that is only possible in this moment, where a citizen can record something. More than that, he or she can, having recorded it, disseminate it immediately, widely. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain technological features, whether it is the recording of an event, its dissemination, organizing efforts to protest it, etc., which are relative to what has historically been true now but never before. Got it? It's a big change. It's also true, and here I stray into terrain that I know only from a distance. I've long wondered and suspected that there are moments when the social change occurs. One view is it occurs glacially, that, look, we're trying to get to that thing over there. Yeah? And so here's what we do. Between now and whatever day, I'll go 0.6, then the next guy will go 0.6, and kind of like that. Yeah? But when one examines racial progress in the United States, and not only racial progress, but let me focus on that for a second, one is struck by the sharpness of change. Yeah? That things are going along, and then somebody decides, no, I'm not gonna go to the back of the bus today. I'm just not. Yeah? And that launches all sorts of things. Yeah?
Right.
And then so it's going along, and then there is civil rights legislation is just sitting in Congress, and it's not moving for a long, long time. Yeah? And then there's the unfortunate murder of a president, and then something happens. Yeah,
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yes.
That there is a possibility that the intensity, the range, the passion of this moment suggests we might be on the cusp of such an episode, where this is the moment to make change because of how we all feel. Yeah, before our attention is distracted, as happens in this vast and powerful democracy, there'll be some other thing. But okay. Yeah. But I've been struck by the sustained nature of people's expression of outrage about this, and the widespread nature of that expression of outrage. And it suggests to me that we might be at a moment where people are inclined to do things, to think differently, to innovate, to try. Yeah? And so I do believe we are at a special moment. We may be at a special moment too because of progress that has occurred along racial grounds. I've already mentioned that there is lots to regret, yeah? But there are things to applaud as well. Here's one thing. I'm a dean of a policy school. I'm a dean interested in policy at a business school. Yeah? I can think of deans. Cornell is just named the dean of engineering, who's a black man. Yeah? The dean of the Harvard Education School is a black woman. I'm going to stop because I'm going to forget to mention somebody, but you get the point.
Yes.
There are editorial desk directors who are people of color. So there exists, because of improvements that have occurred because of the efforts of people who came before me, there are people in positions, not all powerful positions, yeah, but positions that are also not powerless, yeah? Who can, by virtue of their presence and the execution of their role, emphasize certain things in conversation, suggest various policies, remind those who report to them, who work with them, about the importance of this thing. That's another important historical moment too. It is not to be devalued or downweighted. So that's a second reason, I believe, that this is the moment. I'll mention one other thing before I close, sorry. So what have I been struck by as I look at these protests and think about them and listen and read people's testimonials and so on? I've been struck by the multiracial nature of the outrage, the protest, the activity. Okay?
Yeah, that's true.
It's really striking.
Yeah.
It's not a black protest.
No.
It's not a black protest. Okay? When I think about letters I receive as dean about what we will be doing at the school and so on, they come to me from faculty who are not faculty of color. They come to me from students who are not Black or Latino. Yeah? They come from people who are white men and women, who are outraged by what they see, who want things to be different, don't know exactly how. That too is something we should pause, appreciate, and build upon. The multi-natured, all-encompassing nature of the desire to make fundamental and lasting change is another reason for optimism about this moment.
And yet there is a shocking unpredictability of life as a Black American in our country. You can become dean of the Yale School of Management, you can become president of the United States, and you can go out for a jog and lose your life.
Yeah. Yes. There is, yeah. There are two stories that occurred, or just around the time of Mr. Floyd's unfortunate killing. There's a story of a jogger in Atlanta, I believe.
Yes.
I don't know every detail about the case, but there was something about that too that deeply bothered me, deeply pained me, and lives with me still. As you say, the unpredictability of it, the kind of, there exists in the world some set of people willing to do evil things. Yeah. And one can interact with them unexpectedly, randomly, and that's a thing to be very concerned about. I believe that the events of the last month will cause people to reflect upon how they view their fellow citizens and their obligation, their moral obligation, to look out for, I'll define what I mean in a second, their brothers and sisters. Here's what I mean. I'm not a jogger, I should be. I need to lose 5 to 10 immediately, John, I tell you.
Join the club.
Yeah. But I'd like to know, it would be nice to know, and I think it is true where I live. But there are joggers who are not Black, who will be aware of how I'm seen when I'm jogging, and who will express some kind of allyship, I guess is the expression, or look over the shoulder for me, kind of like that. Okay? See, I'm not precise in my definition here, but you know what I mean, yeah? There is some kid doing something on my corner, yeah? And I think the sign said, no loud music after 5. I think it's at that. And it's 5:10. And he is 15. And he's with his friends. I have a choice here. I have a choice. I can decide whether I'm going to call the cops right away at 5:10. In fact, whether I'm going to call the cops at all. Yeah? Because calling the cops does things. You've unleashed a whole chain of potential events. Yeah? That's what a policy the government can affect. You see? True. That's something you can do. Yeah?
That's really true.
These are the examples, I mean, that are detached from officialdom, from judicial UKs and policy made at the federal or national government. They're things that you, John, can do today, or desist from doing.
Right.
Because those things, in the aggregate, have a major consequence for the person affected. So.
Really true. The role of higher education. We know that one's fundamental education, grammar in high school, if you are Black, is often compromised. It's underfunded. And that it may very well be at the root of the inability of more Black people to access higher education and have at least a tool in their kit for social mobility. But then those who do have within reach the opportunity to gain a college degree and beyond, what can be done there? What are the prescriptions, the policy changes that we need to see higher education to afford more opportunity to African Americans and other minorities?
So I've already mentioned this point, but it's a very good question about the role that education in general plays, and education in college in particular. And I'm going to say, when I say higher education, I mean college and professional type training. You remember earlier we were talking about this interactor or aggregator function that schools play, bringing different kinds, types, ideas together. Yeah. That function, for that function to work well, the place must be richly diverse, period. That the benefit of this aggregator or interactor function of Yale or Columbia or Penn State or Arizona State, whatever, yeah, is very seriously delimited by the representation of other kinds of faces in the room. Yeah? It is an obligation of great universities, it seems to me, to find every way, every imaginable way to diversify by race. The benefits of diversity having been described by me before. There is also the fact that at levels like this, meaning not just college, but professional training, there's something peculiar about my kind of school in that we engage very closely with employers. Yeah. Students indeed come from the world of work to come here, then go back. Yeah. We have long-standing relationships with employers, doesn't it? To the extent that a major source of Black and Latino, not just Black, but Black and Latino and other disadvantage is what happens in the labor market. Yeah. Our special location in the person-job nexus allows us to ask of our employers, maybe even demand of them, various things. Yeah. Just like we can diversify and must diversify our ranks, you too. What are you doing to think about career ladders, glass ceilings, and other things? Yeah. That we have access to corridors of power that other institutions simply do not possess, and they must be deployed for this most important of social goods. There is this also. What is it we do at university? What is it we're doing? We're doing lots of things. But I think that most university personnel, most professors, most deans or presidents who are reflective, would think that our preeminent activity is the preservation, the dissemination, and the production of new knowledge that improves the human condition. That's what we do. We call that enterprise research and teaching. Yeah. And so what can we do in that space, in our research space, to address this issue and these issues? I've talked about my own research and the fact that it's part of a stream on whatever. But there are other things. Let's take the police, for example.
Right.
Again, I make no anti-police creed. I understand why there needs to be vigorous policing and community. I get that. I also understand that why an individual event, however rare, is taken as hugely salient, even if it might not be representative of every interaction. I get that too. That's not, please nobody write me about that. I get that. But here we are, where this thing happens, and it affects me. And it affects lots of people. You see them in the street. You see them all around the world. You see what happened in Paris. You see what happened in London. This is not just me. And so you say, well, why is this happening? However rarely it happens. One possibility is it might have to do with training. It might have to do with the role, the person who has received insufficient training or improper training about how to engage with this person in this context. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that there's something about the person. The person. Maybe there are kinds of people drawn, maybe a tiny set, yeah? Maybe it's 8 people, let's not argue about numbers, who are drawn to certain occupations. Corrections officer, police officer, maybe. Would it not be good for us all to figure out how one can identify them? Is it, an econometrician might say, is it heterogeneity? Is there something different about the people? Is it state dependence? Is there something about the training? Yeah. We would like to identify them. How does one identify them? I don't know. But I do know there are many brilliant people who study in psychology, who think about things like implicit association tests, IAT, where you can go take them online. I've taken some, where as I gather, it's impossible to cheat, and taking a test reveals something about your implicit bias. Yeah? I don't vouch for the studies here. There are others who can. But imagine that they deliver on their promise. And imagine a university deciding to devote some serious time to thinking about IAT tests can be widely tweaked so as to apply in the police admission stage to identify the X%. Let X be a small number. Let's not argue about the number, okay? Please, let's not argue about the number. But identify the X% of people who might be inclined because of something they carry in their heart to do what was done to Mr. Floyd. Yeah? That would be of immense benefit to society if a university were to do that.
That's true.
They're engineering skills that think about technology of all times. Yeah? Can you tell me about tweaks to body cameras? I don't know these things. My point is that we can divert our research attention to issues that surround this all-important matter. And that would be perfectly consistent with what it is generally understood we do. We scholars do. So that's what I would say our overall role is in universities.
I listened to that and I wonder if in fact you wish you were spending 100% of your time doing research right now instead of being dean. Because I hear the urgency in your voice and I can see the possibilities, frankly.
This year has not been a research year. Let me be honest with you. It's but it is understood about me here at Yale that I'm not giving up my research life.
Right.
It's not going to happen. I have a main job, and the job is to be dean of the school. And I will say that being dean of this school at this moment satisfies certain research urges. There's a set of problems before me. COVID, when we assemble and how. Online instruction and its incorporation into our curriculum. Our international students, when can they come thus and so? Exact CAD, what? Yeah. Yes. In a way, these are all fascinating intellectual problems. Yeah.
Sure.
Second, as dean, I engage with the faculty every day. And engagement with the faculty means hearing ideas, dealing with criticisms, having one's ideas shot down, attempting to persuade. In other words, the job is not unlike my job as a professor, where I have to explain to some referee why his decision to reject my paper is terribly wrong. I've honed my chops in that space, and I'm carrying them over here. But in all seriousness, I expect to return more seriously to research once I have certain things under control, and it'll remain a part of my life in the academy forever.
Well, let me thank you for sharing your time with us. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did as well. And I really enjoyed your candor and your thoughtful insights on your research and its importance, and particularly at this time.
John, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I can't wait to come and see you and shake your hand.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. It's Kerwin Charles, the Dean of the Yale School of Management. This is John Byrne of Poets and Quants. Thanks for watching.